Hello again. So we've covered at a very rapid pace, unfortunately, the sacred music of the Middle Ages, that being pretty much Gregorian chant, and then the organum, which is the earliest type of polyphonic music, which itself is based upon Gregorian chant. It's Gregorian chant with additional lines of melody. Organum, of course, went through this very long sort of evolution. So we have an earlier type, which we call parallel organum, and then hundreds of years later we have a more complex type called florid organum or Notre Dame organum, because it's associated most closely with two composers in particular who were active in Paris as choir masters, music directors at Notre Dame Cathedral, which was just being built in the 12th century. So we've kind of zoomed up into the late Middle Ages, covering this at a pretty quick pace. And one of the things that I mentioned last time, so that was all review, but one of the things I mentioned was that toward, let's say, the 1100s, the 12th century, we see maybe a bit more progress than we had seen earlier in the Middle Ages. In fact, this period is sometimes called the 12th century Renaissance. Not to confuse it with the Renaissance, which is a big era that comes later. But nonetheless, I think, as I said again last time, if you had to go back and live in the Middle Ages, none of us would want to, but if you had to, the 12th century in Paris, or France generally, would have been a good time and place. Paris was really sort of the leading cultural center of the late Middle Ages, as we've seen in developments in architecture, in the first university, among the first universities, the University of Paris, and the development of the earliest type of polyphonic music. So there's lots of stuff happening culturally. One of the things that starts to happen from this point on to really the end of the Middle Ages is what I will call the increased secularization of the culture. Now, we have to keep in mind this is increased secularization within a very religious culture, right? So as I said, the church was the single most powerful institution. The clergy were the most powerful class of society throughout the Middle Ages. But as we get into the later Middle Ages, the 1100s, the 1200s, the 1300s, we see more interest in secular things, things of this world. And this is part of the process that's going to, in fact, bring about the Renaissance. What we're seeing now is sort of the foundation being laid eventually for the Renaissance, which comes in 1450. So one of the aspects of that foundation being laid, of course, is the earliest universities. The University of Paris, which was founded, I think, around 1170 or so, and the University of Bologna, again, right around that time. But within a short time, universities begin popping up all over Europe. And, of course, one of their main courses of study is theology, because, of course, all the professors at these universities are monks or priests of some kind. But you can also study law, you can study medicine. Those are the three big ones: medicine, law, and theology. But then there also comes to be this sort of grab bag of other subjects, which they are lumped sort of under the category of philosophy. Now, the word philosophy doesn't mean exactly today what it meant back then. It literally means love of knowledge in Greek. Philo means love of, and sophi means wisdom, actually, love of wisdom. But what was meant by it back then was just anything else, especially, let's say, the sciences, which was called natural philosophy back then. They didn't really have the word science. They had the word natural philosophy, philosophy of nature, trying to understand nature. And after all, nature is a thing of this world, right? The fact that this is now considered to be something important to study, right, is an indication that people's minds are beginning slowly to turn in a secular direction rather than being solely focused on the sacred realm, right? So that's my segue into today's lecture, which is about secular music of the Middle Ages. And the first thing to say about it, I guess, maybe we should review what secular means. It simply means having nothing to do with religion. So the second thing to say about secular music is we don't see a lot of it until relatively late in the Middle Ages. Because prior to this time, although there certainly was secular music, there were love songs, there were lullabies, there was music to dance to, that stuff just wasn't considered important enough to write down. And also, the people playing it probably didn't know how to write music. They just knew how to sing, or they knew how to play an instrument. They knew how to write songs, or how to create songs, perhaps, but probably not how to write them down. And remember, that's the problem with music. If it isn't written down, it's just sort of gone as soon as it's produced. It's gone with the wind, right? So, when the book starts to talk about secular music in the Middle Ages, they mention that the first large and important body of secular songs, that is, other than little isolated secular songs, like, for example, remember the epitaph of Secularization, right? That drinking song that was carved on the tombstone that we looked at in the previous unit in the music of the ancient world. That was a secular song. It was a drinking song. But it was just a one-off. We don't know enough about other secular music of that time because it wasn't written down nearly as much. We don't know enough about it to say, here was the style of this secular music, to make generalizations about it. So the first time we get enough secular music, that is a large body of secular song, is in the 12th and 13th centuries, the 1100s and the 1200s. And the people who created these songs were known as either the Troubadours, or the Trouveres, or the Minnesingers. They were sometimes known as Jongleurs, right? And all these names, basically, most of them kind of mean the same thing. They're sort of like amateur singer-songwriters. Some of them were professionals, that is, they did it in order to make money. But most of them were simply knights, members of the nobility, who, as sort of a hobby, as a pastime, wrote poems and songs. Now remember, the nobility, the knightly class, these people don't work for a living. They own land and they fight in the wars, but it's kind of considered beneath them to do work. That's what peasants or commoners do, right? And even the work of writing songs or performing songs was seen as kind of low class, which is very different from today. Today, pop stars are sort of like royalty, right? They're fabulously wealthy, and they're sort of like our modern royalty. There's lots of everyone wants to know who they are seeing or who they're, their social life, all of this stuff, whatever scandals attached to them, right? It was not at all like that back then. Back then, the only sort of royalty was real royalty, or the nobility, let's say. Your class, your rank was everything. And in fact, sort of professional entertainers, as the book mentions, like professional actors, singers, musicians, were actually at a sort of a low social class. Right? Anyway, so these troubadours, who were the original singer-songwriters, started out in what is today southern France. but which was back then, let's say in the late 11th century, the 12th century, the early 13th century, was a kind of an autonomous region, a duchy, that is, it was ruled by a duke, called Aquitaine. And this name Aquitaine, it was actually the name of the old Roman province. That is southern France, mostly sort of on the Atlantic coast, down near the Pyrenees Mountains. The Pyrenees are that mountain range that divides France from Spain. Right? So the Troubadours are the first of these singer-songwriters. And then later, their style, their songs were imitated by the Trouveres in France proper, that is in northern France, and by the Minnesingers over in Germany. There's not much difference that is between their songs, between the style of songs. The main difference really is just the language difference. The Troubadours wrote their songs in a language which is back then was called Occitan, right? And which is, I guess, today most similar to the dialect known as Provençal, which is spoken in Provence in France, again, southern France. Occitan was a language that is sort of between Spanish and French, which kind of makes sense because geographically that's where Aquitaine was. It was in southern France, close to Spain. So they had a distinct language back then, which is still, I guess, the descendants of those people still speak a similar dialect today called Provençal. But it was a separate language back then, a Romance language, that is, a language that was descended from Latin. The Troubadours wrote their songs in Provençal, or Occitan, as it was called then. The Trouveres wrote their songs in French. Now, it was probably Middle French. It might not be exactly the same as modern French, but it was close enough. Right? It was in French. And then the Minnesingers over in Germany wrote their songs in German. Right? But the subject matter of these songs is pretty similar. And we can kind of sum up the type of subject matter, sort of the vibe or the mood of these songs in the term courtly love. That is, love at court. Whose court? Not traffic court, not food court. The court of a nobleman like the Duke of Aquitaine. So again, this is part of this increased secularization of the culture. When we get past around the year 1000 or so, the nobility, who previously had been uneducated, illiterate, right? Their main business was fighting, remember. They were the warrior class. They also gradually became the landowner class, right? Because in exchange for fighting for their liege lord or for the king, they were given land, right? So they were warriors / landowners. But they eventually started to take sort of an interest in literacy and education. Probably one reason they started to take an interest in literacy and education is because they kind of wanted to knock the clergy. They wanted to take the clergy down a peg or two. Remember, the clergy are the most powerful class. They're sort of king of the hill. And what are among the advantages they have on the nobility? They are educated, right? That makes a big difference. Right? And so the nobility, after around the year 1000 or so, take an active interest in education. This is part of the reason that we have universities starting to appear in the 1100s, because there's a certain amount of demand, right? Because let's say, the sons of the nobility want to educate themselves, maybe in order to get a prestigious position within the church, maybe just because they don't have anything else to do, right? So there is this interest in education, including literature, including music, including languages, all kinds of things. Right? So this is why we don't start to see much in the way of secular music that is written down until the 1100s, the late 1000s, the 1100s, the 1200s, the 1300s. Right? Because before then, the nobility were just not that interested in writing songs or writing poems. They didn't have the ability to. They were illiterate. Right? So, anyway, courtly love. What's that all about? Love at court. So these are love songs, okay? And by the way, whether they are written in the Occitan language, like Troubadours, or French, like the Trouveres, or German, like the Minnesingers over in Germany, those are all what we would consider vernacular languages, languages other than Latin, right? So we could say that all of these types of love songs are in the vernacular, and the subject matter of them is pretty similar. So what the subject matter tends to be about is love. They are love songs, but they have to do with the sort of the intrigues and the tangled love lives of courtiers. What the heck is a courtier? Well, if you're a king or a duke, some powerful nobleman, you are constantly surrounded by a sort of a retinue, an entourage of lesser nobility who kind of hang around you, partly because they want to be close to the source of power, right? Powerful people always attract other, aspiring, often conniving, or just kind of people who like to hang around. So the courtiers are those who hang around a royal court. Now, those courtiers are also members of the nobility, but probably lesser in rank than whoever's court they are at. Right? And one thing to keep in mind, during the Middle Ages, so many things that are different in that society compared to today. In those days, marriage had very little to do with love. That is especially for, let's say, the nobility. What marriage was a way of creating family connections, right? Hopefully, let's say, connections of mostly equal rank, or hopefully you would want to maybe marry someone of higher rank than yourself, or you would, it's not even about whether you want to marry somebody or not. It's about who your parents want you to marry. Marriages were arranged, right? And the idea of marrying for love was, it just didn't really occur to anybody. It just wasn't done, really. You might marry someone and come to love them eventually. That'd be a nice outcome, but usually the person you married, if you were a member of the nobility in the Middle Ages, you might meet the person that you are marrying on your wedding day, and you might both be about 14 or 15 years old. And you just don't have any say in the matter, whether you are the husband or the wife in this situation. Because marriage was something that families arranged in order to create connections between families, often in order to consolidate or acquire land. Remember, this is a land-based society. Wealth is land in the Middle Ages. It's not like money, cash, it's land. Okay, so if love has really little or nothing to do with marriage, well, there's still love. It just doesn't take place within necessarily the bonds of marriage, right? And so very often, in fact, all of these songs, for the most part, are not like happily ever after love songs, like boy meets girl, boy and girl fall in love, boy and girl get married. No, it's more like I am in love with this woman, and again, usually the troubadour is usually a man. We do have some female troubadours, but most of them are men. And always the songs are from the point of view of someone who is in love with someone who is, first of all, unavailable, because probably she is like the lady of the manor. That is, she is probably the wife of whoever's court it is, right? She is the duchess, or she is the countess, or whatever. She is some high-ranking lady who is above you and is unattainable, right? But nonetheless, you are desperately in love with her. And very often in these songs, it's like, I'm so in love with her, but she pays me no attention. Or sometimes she's nice to me, sometimes she's cruel to me, she's toying with my emotions, I don't know what to do, I think I'm going to go crazy, right? That's what all of these songs tend to be like. I'm in love with her, or I'm in love with him, but he doesn't love me as much as I love him, or she doesn't love me as much as I love her. Now, it's hard to know, was there that much heartache and frustration going on in the Middle Ages, or was this courtly love thing just a style, just kind of like a pose that was expected in these kind of love songs? For example, was it more the case that, let's say, whoever the big shot in the house is, let's say the Duke, whose court, you are a courtier within, maybe it's just kind of flattering to this high-ranking nobleman if some of his lesser courtiers are madly in love with his wife and write love songs saying how beautiful and how wonderful she is, but I don't have a chance at her because I'm just a lowly knight and she is a great lady. And so it's hard to know, again, how many of these are really sincere and how many of them it's just sort of part of an act, or part of a ritualized kind of way of being at court. Probably a little bit of both. It's just like love songs today. When you listen to songs by these pop stars, I mean, do they really reflect what's going on in that pop star's life? Like, does Taylor Swift really have all these problems with guys that maybe she does. I don't know. I don't really follow all that stuff. But just kind of giving you a connection to today, because, some things are very different. Some things never change, obviously. Okay, so we have the Troubadours, the Trouveres, the Minnesingers. The book doesn't really mention the Minnesingers too much, if at all, but they are just like the Troubadours and Trouveres. They're just in Germany. They are poet, singer, songwriters. By the way, the word troubadour actually means seeker. And the word trouver in French means the same thing. Actually, if you've taken French, the verb trouver means to find or to seek. And it's not really known why they were called that. That's just what they were called. I think there's some speculation that it might have to do with the wandering lifestyle of these troubadours, because what they would do very often is they would travel from one castle to another, looking for ultimately a steady gig, but looking to entertain the occupants of the castle. And if they do a good enough job, maybe they'll be kept on permanently or semi-permanently as part of the staff of the castle. Now, you've got to remember, those days, there was not a lot of entertainment. You might look at a castle and think, oh, how wonderful, how romantic to live in such a place. But it was actually, even living in a castle was a pretty hard life. Castles are damp, cold, uncomfortable. They're usually in the middle of the countryside, so there is nothing to do. Of course, you can have jousts, you can have tournaments, and that's how a lot of times the medieval nobility occupied themselves. But some guy comes knocking on your door and says, good evening, sir, my name is whatever, and I sing songs, and I recite poetry, and I can do magic tricks, I can juggle, I've got this dog that can walk on its hind legs and jump through a hoop of fire. That was like awesome entertainment in the Middle Ages, So a lot of these singer-songwriters were multi-talented individuals. They had a whole act. They weren't necessarily just singers or songwriters. They were sort of multi-purpose performers. In fact, some of them, sometimes they had the name Jongleurs. Jongleur literally means juggler, right? So sometimes these guys call themselves troubadours or Trouveres. Sometimes they call themselves jongleurs. There might be sort of a difference or a distinction between them. So a troubadour is usually a knight, member of the noble class, who writes songs, poems and songs, like poems set to music, but doesn't necessarily perform them himself. Because remember, performing is kind of like a low-class thing to do. So the knight or the troubadour might write the songs, and then the jongleur who comes knocking on his castle door one day, showing up saying, I've got an act, I do this, I do that. The knight might say, well, come on in. Actually, it turns out I'm something of a songwriter and poet myself. I'll give you some of my songs to sing, and maybe tomorrow night at our banquet, you can be the featured entertainment. And if that jongleur or traveling sort of minstrel performer does a good job, maybe he would be kept on as sort of permanent staff, which would be a wonderful thing because nobody likes, walking around from one castle to another in the dark, in the rain, before there were good roads, Traveling in the Middle Ages was nasty business. So if you could get a permanent gig and settle down as sort of like a court jester, court performer, that was the dream of the wandering jongleur or low-class troubadour. Some of these troubadours and trouveres were quite high class. Some of them were low class. The ones who called themselves jongleurs or jugglers or minstrels, they were low class. Okay, now there's an example of a kind of an unusual troubadour song by a female troubadour, a countess named Beatrice, Countess of Dia. Southern France, again, that region that was back then called Aquitaine. And so I will post a link to this song, which is already in your listening. By the way, some of these, I think the example, the recording that they used for this song by Beatrice, which is called I Must Sing, or A Chantar, in the Aquitaine language. I think they do a lot of like adding instruments and stuff like that, which, here's the thing about these troubadour songs. The way they are written, that is, the way they're actually written down, they are strictly monophonic. You've got a melody and you've got some words, and that's it. Now, they probably were performed with instruments. We're not sure, but it's probable that there were instruments playing along, like maybe the troubadour, the jongleur, played a lute, it's a guitar-like instrument, and accompanied himself as he sang. We don't really know. All we have are, in some cases, just the words to the song that have been written down or preserved. Sometimes we have the words and the pitches, right? But in no case do we have any rhythmic notation, because these guys didn't really know how to do that. Now, last time I talked a little bit about rhythmic notation in organum, which is sacred music, which is from right around this same time, right? The organum of Notre Dame that I talked about last time, florid organum, this polyphonic music with specific rhythmic notation, with the rhythm written in. That's being composed at the same time as this stuff. But the difference is those priest composers like Léonin and Periton and others who are writing organum have much more training. They know stuff that these guys don't know, especially in terms of music notation, right? These guys, these troubadours, are kind of like gifted amateurs, and they know how to write words, they know how to write pitches, but they don't know how to write rhythms. So this is another thing about these troubadour songs. They don't have any rhythmic notation, so we kind of have to guess at what the rhythm of these songs might be. Fortunately, it's not that hard to guess, because all of these songs, the lyrics to these songs, are poems which have a certain meter. Remember back when I talked about meter, back in the elements unit, I said that meter is often related, meter in music is often related to meter in poetry. We have certain poetic meters, that is, combinations of long and short syllables that are strung out in each line of poetry, right? All of this poetry that was set to music by the Troubadours and Trouveres and Minnesingers was always in a type of meter. And therefore the meter gives you a clue as to what the rhythm might have been like. But again, it's just a clue and there's some guesswork involved. When we make a modern day recording or performance of these Troubadour or Trouvere songs, we kind of have to use our imagination quite a bit. Because again, the only thing that they left us was the words, and sometimes just the words. I mean, we know it's a song, but all we have are the words to the song. Or the words and the pitches. But never any rhythm, never any indication of should there be instruments playing along or not. Since this was secular music, there would be no problem with singing and playing instruments. Remember, it's just sacred music, music for the church, in which case we probably would not have instruments playing along because the church frowns upon the use of instruments in a sacred situation. Okay, so I will post an example of this song by Beatriz of Dia, and I'll also put up there another Troubadour song, probably the single best known Troubadour and maybe his best known song. The Troubadour's name is Bernard Deventadorn. He's among the last of the Troubadours. He's like, I believe, late 1100s, 1200s. And his song, Conve la leceta mover, which means when I see the lark move. And so since that's probably one of the best known Troubadour songs, I'll put that one up there in addition to this song by Beatriz of Dia. The other type of secular music from the Middle Ages, which is mentioned in the book, is music for dance, music to dance to. And this is covered, again, at the very bottom of page 74 and going over a little bit into 75 in the 9th brief edition. So there's probably always been dancing as long as there's been human beings like us. And in order to dance, you gotta have music, right? Thing is, music for dancing to was not written down for the most part, right? The earliest, again, large body of instrumental dance music, which has survived to the present day, where we can look at it and say, aha, we know what this is dance music, is a type of dance from France, which is the most dance-obsessed nation, I think. The French love their dance and ballet, the very strong tradition of that art form in France. And there's a particular type of dance called an estampie, which was apparently very popular in the 1100s and the 1200s in France. And estampie, kind of the closest translation in English would simply be a stamp or a stomp. It's like a lively stamping or stomping type of dance in triple meter. Right? So I think a few hundred of these estampie tunes have survived to the present day. They were written down. Somebody, at some point, people started writing them down to preserve them. And again, all we have is just the melody. There's no indication of like what instruments you're supposed to play. And in fact, it was probably not a big deal. It's like whatever instrument you have, doesn't matter. Here's a melody. Here's a dance melody. Play it, and people will dance. Right? The Middle Ages in general was much more about vocal music than instrumental music. They did have instruments, they did have some instrumental music, but this is a time that is really dominated by vocal music. Certainly the serious composers, the trained, learned composers, all write vocal music. Instrumental music is just kind of like a sideline for kind of lower class people. Not that I'm sure the wealthy nobility like to dance, right? But the people playing the music as they danced were probably servants or lower class people. So I'll put up an example of an estampillé as well. Again, this is an example that's already found in your book, but for those of you who bought the book used, don't have access to the listening, I will find the exact same estampillé that is part of the listening for the book, and I will put a link to it in my saved videos and also on D2L. So, in looking at the music of the Middle Ages so far, remember, our sort of broad categorization scheme is, on the one hand, we have sacred music. On the other hand, we have secular music. Sacred music of the Middle Ages includes Gregorian chant and organum. Both of these genres are strictly vocal, no instruments going on. Remember, that's what a cappella means. We don't want to have instruments in church. Right? Organum is monophonic, single line of melody and nothing else. It's basically arrhythmic. There's no beat, there's no meter. Right? It's very easy to sing. Organum provides the basis for a later type of music. Gregorian chant provides the basis for a later type of music called organum, which is polyphonic. Right? And then we have two types of organum that we've looked at: the early parallel organum and the much later, more sophisticated florid organum or Notre Dame organum. But over here on the sacred side, so far we've got Gregorian chant and organum. Over on the secular side, we have various types of love songs by usually noble, that is of the nobility, singers, songwriters, and sometimes lower class like entertainers, performers. Those singers, songwriter, poets include the Troubadours from modern-day southern France, the Trouveres from modern-day northern France, and the Minnesingers from Germany. And we also have these sort of wandering minstrels, call themselves Jongleurs. And then on the secular side also we have instrumental music for dancing to. And the most important genre there is the estampillé. And all of this stuff on the secular side is late Middle Ages. Not that they didn't have it in the earlier Middle Ages, we just don't have it today. It wasn't written down. But it did start to be written down as we get into this later, more secularized world of the late Middle Ages. I'm trying to tie it all together for you. The farther we go in the Middle Ages, the more we see this trend towards secularization, towards the nobility taking an interest in literature, art, culture, music, dancing, the finer things in life, the things of this world, right? And also seeing education as a way to kind of nip at the heels of the nobility, right, whom they're trying to knock off of their position as sort of king of the hill. Well, all of these trends are going to come to a head in the 14th century. Now, the 14th century is still part of the Middle Ages. It's the last complete century of the Middle Ages. Remember, when I talk about the 14th century, I'm talking about the 1300s. Once we get into the 1400s, we're really kind of talking about either the transition to the Renaissance or really the Renaissance. The book uses 1450 as the beginning of the Renaissance, but really the Renaissance was well underway in Italy, I would say really about 1400 or so. It just took a while for it to spread, for the influence to spread out of Italy and into the rest of Europe. But it did. Okay, the 14th century, though, the 1300s, was a time of great turmoil, as we will see, And it's also a time that within music history has its own little sub-era. Again, it's still part of the Middle Ages. It's the tail end of the Middle Ages. And this period, the 14th century in music history, we sometimes refer to as the Ars Nova period. Ars Nova simply means new art. And it's actually the title of a book that was written around that time, a book on new techniques in music composition. The book was called Ars Nova Musica, the new art of music. And because many of the features described in that book are characteristic of the music of that time, we sometimes just refer to that era in music history, the 1300s, as the Ars Nova. Right? Now that's going to be the subject of my next lecture, but I'm just kind of giving you a little preview of it. They start to discuss the Ars Nova, or New Art period, in halfway down page 77. Now, at the same time as we have this Ars Nova period in France, in the 1300s, we also have a great kind of cultural awakening going on, or a time of great, sort of a cultural peak, especially in literature, in Italy, called the Trecento. The Trecento simply means the 1300s, right? So it's the same period of time. If we're talking about literature and music in France, we use the term Ars Nova. But if we're talking about literature and music in Italy, we might use the term Trecento instead. The Trecento is when you have, for one thing, the three greatest poets in Italy, all living around the same time: Dante Alighieri, Boccaccio, and Petrarch. Right? And we also have a very great composer, Landini. Now, the book doesn't mention Landini too much, but Landini is the greatest Italian composer of the 14th century, of the 1300s. I'm going to talk a little bit about Landini next time. The book focuses more on Guillaume de Machaut, who is the greatest French composer of this time. Not only was the greatest French composer, he was the greatest French poet of the 14th century. If you ever took a class in medieval French poetry, you would definitely be studying the works of Guillaume de Machaut, who's a very interesting, fascinating, kind of a weird guy. So I'm going to talk about the 1300s next time. I'm going to talk about what's going on. Why is it such a traumatic and turbulent time? And also about these two composers, Landini and especially Machaut. So next time we will cover the Ars Nova, and that will be the last lecture on the Middle Ages. After that, we will start to get into the Renaissance. So, sort of as I did with the Middle Ages, I'm going to have a lecture just on the cultural, historical background of the Renaissance. And then I'm going to get into talking about the music, right? And that'll probably take at least 3 lectures. So, at the end of that time, we will have a test. That is to say, you should probably be starting to get ready for your next test, maybe a week from this Monday, something like that. All right? I'll post more specific times as we get closer on D2L. All right? So until then, see you next time.